So thank you for joining. We were really thrilled to see that there was a lot of people interested in the ZooMu network, and we are very excited to share this project with you today. A few housekeeping items. Please use the Q&A feature to type in your questions. We will try to have panelists, which consists of our PIs and our steering committee members, answer these questions while the presentation is going on, but we also have time after the presentation ends to address any questions that we weren't able to get to. This webinar will be recorded and shared on the ZooMu website. It's zoomunetwork.org. So if you know anybody that was interested that perhaps couldn't make it to the session, please feel free to share this information. But let's get started. So what is the ZooMu network, or ZooMu? It is a 5-year NSF-funded research coordination network project. The goal is to form a cross-institutional network connecting biodiversity collections at zoos and aquariums, which I will just call zoos, and natural history museums, which I'll refer to as museums. And in a lot of ways, we see these two institutions as being very logically linked. So zoos have living collections and museums have preserved collections. But they're the same in a lot of ways. So zoos actually take care of an animal from the moment it's born. They continuously collect data on growth, development, reproduction, on behavior, all the way up to when the animal dies. Natural history museums actually take the data from the moment an animal dies. So it's a snapshot of when this animal dies, and they're able to preserve the sample for perpetuity and continue to collect the data in a lot of different ways, sometimes in ways that we really can't even predict right now. So the goal of ZooMu is to form a long-lasting and transdisciplinary network that really connects these two maybe different, but in a lot of ways complementary biological collections and broaden the access to collection data and material. ZooMu is led by Caldwell at the Yale Peabody Museum, Stephen Whitfield at Audubon Nature Institute, Alex Shepek at Florida International University, and myself at the Memphis Zoo. This project is guided by our advisory board, and with a substantial contribution from our steering committee members, many who are here today. And these represent colleagues from zoos, aquariums, museums, botanical gardens, university collections, and so on. We're also assisted in this project by external evaluators from Informed Evaluation and Research, and they make sure to check in with us periodically to see that we're reaching the milestones and goals that we set out for ourselves. They will also be the ones that will be after this webinar for surveys, because we do want to collect input from everybody from the community. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thanks, Sheila. When we set out to begin thinking about the potential for zoo and museum collaboration, we wanted to really think critically about some of the disparities between the way these two really data sources were managed and how these different areas operated. And to that end, a lot of us within this initial group, we're coming at it from an academic bend of how can we best use data that's coming out of zoos and how can we improve our collaboration with them. And as we began to dive into what we found is that there was a huge disparity in how biological collections were considered here in the United States. And so really, really importantly, at the highest levels of STEM policy, we see that typically biological collections are discussed. When we discuss biological collections, we're thinking about museums. And oftentimes, not giving enough credit to these living collections that are held in zoos and aquariums. And so while zoos are holding an incredible amount of data, and there's an incredible wealth of knowledge within that sphere, oftentimes it does not get involved in those initial collections around initial conversations around biodiversity collections. And really, we feel that this was a prime starting place to better understand that we needed to figure out how to integrate these groups and have a joint conversation into ways that we can serve both entities and the larger sort of natural history and life sciences community in general. Next slide. And to that end, this really started in earnest with some conversations that began with this group of PIs at the Snowbird Utah Joint Meeting of Ichthyology and Herpetology in 2019. At that meeting, there was a conversation and a symposium around the expanding role of natural history collections in research. And out of that conversation really began this conversation around how can we better serve both communities and what are some of the sort of major roadblocks. And the first thing we realized is that the four of us were woefully unprepared and needed to broaden out and talk to a lot more people. And so to that end, we organized and submitted a proposal to iDig Bio to hold our first ZooMu workshop. This workshop was held in 2021, and it was really a chance to bring together representatives from zoos, museums, aquariums, and academia to discuss ways that we could begin thinking about collaboration in the future. And based off the success of that, we submitted another iDig Bio proposal, and we held ZooMu 2 in 2022. Both our ZooMu meetings were then sort of pulled together into a publication that came out in Bioscience in 2022 titled Bridging the Research Gap Between Live Collections in Zoos and Preserved Collections in Natural History Museums. And a copy of this paper is available on our website that Sheila shared before. And I think really importantly, these early conversations involved over 30 institutions across that spread to just begin thinking about where are the opportunities, where are the risks, and what are the ways that as a community we can work through them. Out of that publication, those iDig Bio workshops, we also began holding symposia at more focused meetings. So in 2023, we held symposia at the Joint Meeting of Ichthyology and Herpetology, the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections, the Zoo Registrar Association, and the AZA mid-year meetings, all continuing this conversation around what can we do, where are we at currently, and what do people want to see going forward. And finally, starting this year, we've begun our Research Coordination Network grant. This is a fantastic opportunity to take all of those sort of early conversations and begin putting them into practice. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how we've gotten here on the next slide. So our first ZooMu workshop held by iDig Bio was entirely virtual, as many of us recall those past years. We shifted very quickly to a virtual setting, but still found it to be incredibly fruitful in the discussion around where we were at currently with zoo and museum collaboration, how folks were using data from both of these institutions, how we should think about beginning collaborations, what has worked in the past and what hasn't. And so this fantastic group of folks came together and really started to lay the groundwork for what we're now introducing today, which is the ZooMu RCN. And these conversations really spurred us into action and moved us into ZooMu 2. On the next slide. And ZooMu 2 was really all about identifying a path forward, including our roadblocks and places that either theoretically or in past practice have really stood in the way of successful collaboration between zoos, museums, aquariums, academia, and other institutions. And then finally, we really started thinking about what resources would be beneficial, not just continued conversation, but what sorts of deliverables, what sorts of larger sort of frameworks would be helpful on both sides of the aisle to fostering this collaboration. And so that's where we ended with ZooMu 2 and really began thinking about our next steps towards a really robust network. And concurrent with all of this, we began to see movement among two of our primary sort of entities that represent large amounts of the zoo and museum communities. So the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections amended their bylaws to include living collections, and now includes the phrase living collections in their 10-year strategic plan, really highlighting that we're now looking at sort of inclusion of not just those preserved collections that are typically held in natural history museums, but ways to think more broadly about collections as including both the living and dead. And we also saw changes in the AZA, Association of Zoos and Aquariums, guidelines, in particular around responsible population management. There's now language that really promotes the idea of developing agreements for specimen transfer between AZA institutions and non-AZA entities like universities and museums. And ultimately, this is really positive groundwork that we're seeing in part because we're now expose these communities and we're having those conversations. And so we're able to capitalize on successes that other groups have been making as well and begin that conversation in the broader context. And so we're really excited to be able to not only capitalize on all the fantastic conversations we've had in ZooMu 1 and 2 towards this RCN, but all the fantastic work that Spinach and AZA have been doing as well towards kind of broadening out the scientific community around both of these collection types. Next. And we had some sort of really clear opportunities or lessons from our early ZooMu activities. And really all it boils down to is that there are a lot of mutual benefits to collaboration. So we really view this connection between zoos and museums as a two-way street and a way to share data in both directions. And it highlighted, however, that there are some major roadblocks that we are currently seeing. So there's really has been some exclusion of zoos from that traditional biological collection community, and that limits the potential impact of zoos to biodiversity research, which is a huge tenet of what zoos are pushing, but it separates out those communities. And so by changing the language, both on the AZA and spinach side, but also fostering these conversations, we're able to see sort of a more inclusive community and think more broadly about how to do really holistic biodiversity research. We also recognize that both groups have different approaches to digitization of collections, and that a unified approach to digitization can really expand the scientific impact of both of these collection types. And some of this definitely stemmed from a mutual lack of understanding of the shared value between these different collection types. And so a huge part of what we are trying to foster as we move forward is making sure that there's a joint understanding of the benefits of both collection types among the entire community. And ultimately, we found that both groups have signaled a greater interest in collaboration. Museums are definitely very interested in housing zoo specimens post-mortem. There's a ton of utility to these specimens, and not just with the incredible wealth of data they have, but also the diversity of species represented and the ability to bring in biological samples and different methods of thinking as we hold and process these zoo specimens on the museum side. And with that same hope, we would like to be able to pass back that information from zoos or from museums back to zoos to help make strides on that side as well. Next slide. And since both sets of institutions are collections based, we recognize that there are some things that we need to sort of get aligned early on. And so one of the things we want to focus on is that ultimately there is still a very limited understanding and very few formal connections between zoos and natural history museums. And while specific partnerships do exist, they're oftentimes based on individual connections. And so for us, this was a huge opportunity with the ZooMu RCN to begin thinking about how we can foster more institutional connection moving forward and really curate those introductions through some structured networks and some different activities that we'll discuss later on in this presentation. And ultimately, what we found is that everyone we've talked to, whether they're fully in favor or a little bit tentative, is interested in continuing this conversation because as a group, all of our previous participants and many of the folks we've met with at our various symposia have all identified that there's a lot of opportunity here and a lot of great things that can happen through some synergistic activities. Next. And so this led us to kind of constructing a logic model for this RCN, and we'd be happy to share that with folks who are interested in really diving more in depth. What this logic model is based on this idea that by creating an interconnected network of folks from all of these sort of institutions, from zoos, museums, aquaria, universities, nonprofits, by creating this network and fostering conversation, we can come up with a set of documents, of guiding principles, of guidelines that can really help formalize these connections between these zoo and museum entities. Because what we've recognized is that there's misconceptions, there's lack of information, there are a lack of sort of standard practices. And so by entering that space and having a ton of deliverables that we can provide to these institutions, we can put the power in the hands of these institutions to help create those connections and foster that long-term development of relationships. And so not only are we drawing on the fantastic sort of group mind that we've pulled together for the ZooMu RCN that we'll continue to build over the course of the RCN, but we're also able to draw on some really great lessons learned from some of our partners who are already well involved. And Greg will talk a little bit about some of the ways that we're doing that by looking at how zoos and museums have interacted in the past.
Cool. Thanks, Alex. This map shows two examples, one from the zoo perspective and one from the museum perspective. The zoo is Oklahoma City Zoo, and all those orange outbound arrows are tissue samples, anatomical specimens, and whole body specimens post-mortem being sent to universities for research projects or to museums of natural history. The Peabody Museum blue arrows are all inbound. specimens coming in from zoos over the last few decades. And what this map does not show is that each end of each arrow has people who know each other, that somehow there was a personal connection that allowed that to happen. And that's one of the things that ZooMu is working on is ways to expand the idea that this does work, but we need to organize things a bit more. Next slide. So ZooMu is going to have workshops and conferences. ZooMu will host 3 topical meetings that Stephen will talk about in a bit. The 4 regional meetings will happen, and I'll talk about that in a bit. There'll be at least 9 webinars and probably some Zoom meetings also. And at the end, we'll have a big to-do we call ZooMuCon. ZooMu will also fund some people from museums to go to an AZA meeting, and some people from from museums to go to AZA, and from zoos to go to a spinach meeting. Next. One of our primary goals is to increase diversity and have basically everyone in the zoo and museum world represented. At least 50% of participants who are funded to go to an in-person meeting will be women. At least 20% who are funded to go to an in-person meeting will be underrepresented minority demographics, and at least 10% will be students or early career. This is a very important issue for us, and we welcome any help or input in this. So if you have any ideas or this is something you're interested in, please let us know. Next. The topical working groups, which we call TWIGs, are to facilitate networking and communication regarding shared topics and concerns and to share knowledge. The 3 TWIGs are physical collections, cyber infrastructure, and human capacity. And they will take place at Oklahoma City Zoo, Duke Lemur Center, and the Audubon Nature Institute. And if you look at the Gantt chart, you see our first one will be Q1 of 2025, and that will be the one at Duke. Next. The RegNets, as we call them, are to facilitate regional collaborations. On the wonderful map on the right, you see some blue dots and some orange squares. The blue dots represent natural history collections, and the squares represent zoos. And there are the 4 main regions of the United States. So each RegNet will take place in a different place. That makes sense. Southeast will happen at Memphis Zoo. The West will happen at Berkeley. Midwest will be in Minnesota, and the Northeast will be at Yale. Next. And at the end, there will be, like we said before, people from zoos going to spinach meetings and from museums going to AZA meetings. We don't know when the AZA or the spinach meeting will be held in 2028 or where, but wherever it is, we will be there. And then ZooMuCon will be Q1 of 2029. Thanks. Stephen, take it away.
All right, so I'll talk a little bit about the topical working groups, and these are the thematic groups that we determined from past ZooMu activities. So physical collections, cyber infrastructure, and human capacity. Both zoos and aquariums and natural history museums are largely based on their physical collections. We have collections management systems designed to store data on those collections, and we have people who are trained to work with those collections. But very rarely is there, next slide, Sheila, is there kind of interaction between these 2 silos. And a really important point of ZooMu is to kind of bridge the connections between these silos. Next slide. Just as an overview in the nature of collections, zoos and aquariums accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums hold more than 800,000 animals across 16,000 species. These animals receive regular medical care. Most of them are part of cooperative breeding programs. And for most of these animals, we have really detailed data for most of their lives. Zoos may collect biological materials, including blood, tissue, and gametes through the life of the animal, and these are preserved in biobanks. Natural history collections contain 500 million to 1 billion specimens from 1.2 million species. This is more than just vertebrates, this is more than just animals. Specimens may include whole organisms or parts like skins, skeletons, tissues. And if you've only been to the front of house of a natural history museum, what you've probably seen in terms of taxidermy is really a small part of the collections, most of which are prepared for scientific use, not for public display. Like zoos and aquariums, natural history museums may have frozen collections, which they would call cryo collections, and these are largely designed for genomic work. Sheila, next slide. So Sheila mentioned this earlier, but the animal data collected by zoos includes major milestones in the life of an animal, behavior, diet, medical information, all sorts of rich data on the animal. And biological materials may be collected intermittently over the animal's life. When an animal passes away at a zoo or aquarium, the veterinarians conduct necropsy, and then the carcass is disposed of through incineration or some other means. There's just not the capacity to hold on to biological materials, whole specimens. In contrast, natural history museums, it's very rare to have information on the life of the animal, because the way natural history specimens are collected begins with the death of the animal and the collection. And recently, there's been a call within natural history museums for an extended specimen concept. This is an idea that we need more rich data regarding the specimens in natural history collections. And next slide. And so one of the zoo responses to this call for extended specimen concept from the natural history community was that zoos already have a lot of this data. Zoo specimens are by their nature already extended. So if we can just facilitate the transfer of high-value specimens at the end of their life from zoos to natural history museums, and can pass along the data to natural history museums as well, we get a lot closer to that extended specimen concept. Next slide. And another thing that emerged in the earlier ZooMu workshops is that there are real contingencies with permitting that both zoos and aquariums and natural history museums are very sensitive to. We are permitted by the same institutions, although there may be different strategies, different permitting routes, and different experiences that zoos and natural history museums have with these permitting processes. And both institutions are also familiar to donations and loans of specimens as a way to arrange for specimen transfer. So these are things that we have in common that would relate to the transfer of physical specimens. Next slide. So we have some draft goals for the topical working group, and the topical working group participants will help refine these as we move forward through the 5 years of the grant. But in the short term, we want to develop best practices for specimen and sample transfer. In the medium term, we actually want to enact the transfer of select zoo and aquarium specimens to natural history museums at the end of life. And in the long term, we'd really like to have long-term preservation of important biological specimens and samples from zoos and aquariums banked away in natural history collections. Next slide. Moving on to cyber infrastructure, I'll give a brief overview of our collection management systems. For zoos and aquariums, the collection management systems hold animal data, including life milestones, health information, behavioral notes. And within zoos and aquariums, the two most common are the Zoological Information Management System, or ZIMS, and TRACS. And as part, the collection management systems within zoos share data through the software across the zoo and aquarium network. So that sharing across institutions is built into the software. With natural history collections, they also hold data, the collection management systems also hold data on specimens, including the collector, locality, date of location, data collection, any of that associated information. Common collection management systems in zoos and natural history museums include Specify, EMU, Arctos, and Symbiota. In contrast to zoos and aquariums, the data within natural history collections is not shared through the software across institutions. Instead, aggregators are pieces of software that collect data permitted by the natural history museums themselves and compile these into centralized databases. So the data does get centralized, but it's through aggregators rather than through the collection management software itself. Next slide. The data standards are very different from zoos and natural history museums. For zoo animals, many data are sensitive medical records. And while we don't have an explicit data standard for zoo and aquarium data, the starting point that we're working with, just from convenience, is something like HIPAA records. So human medical records, which you would view as very sensitive. This is kind of our starting point for how zoos and aquariums view their data. With zoos and aquariums, data are not interoperable with other platforms. There's this emerging world of global biodiversity informatics that the natural history collection management systems tie into. But zoos are relatively isolated from that because of the way the collection management systems are built. And some data from ZIMS now makes it to the IUCN Red List. And this is a really important step because it helps provide data for the conservation of these species from the zoo collection management systems. Within natural history collections, the collection management systems use Darwin Core as a metadata standard, and that's what facilitates the aggregators collecting data from across multiple platforms because all of the metadata are mapped the same way. And within natural history collections, there's an articulated goal of FAIR data standards. FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so this is a really clear, explicit standard for how natural history museums view their data. Next slide. In terms of data accessibility, the collections information from zoos is available to the public. For example, you can go to a zoo and see which animals are there. You can look on a zoo's website and see which species it holds. But those species holdings are not made available to scientists in a way that would allow someone, for example, to do a search of where all of the Sumatran tigers in the US are if someone wanted to do a population genetic study. They would need to know someone at a zoo who can provide that information, but it's not directed towards scientists. Species 360, the organization that produces and manages ZIMS, does allow requests for anonymized data for external scientists after internal review. In contrast, in natural history collections, there's been a major shift towards accessibility of data on those specimens, facilitated through aggregators. One of the things that came up in earlier ZooMu workshops was that zoos were concerned that their data is inherently sensitive, whereas natural history collection data may not be as sensitive. And that's not the case. Natural history collections may contain data on sensitive species, sensitive information, and that information is simply withheld from aggregators. And the museums themselves have the authority to say what data becomes public and what data is reserved. Next slide. And so again, we have some target goals for the cyber infrastructure working group, but the draft goals we've got are for the short term, increase the accessibility of zoo and aquarium collections data. In the medium term, we'd like to see metadata standards for zoo and aquarium collections data that allows these data sets to be part of an emerging global biodiversity informatics network. And in the long term, we'd like to have select zoo and aquarium data accessible and integrated with global biodiversity platforms. Next slide. Moving along to human capacity, we want to take a good look at who's caring for these collections and how we can enhance our ability to do research with these collections. So within zoos and aquariums, living collections are cared for by animal care staff, like keepers and curators, as well as animal health staff, like veterinarians and vet technicians. Animal records are maintained by animal care, or noted by animal care staff, and are maintained by registrars. There's really few formal training programs for living collections research. So actually doing research on living animals in zoos and aquariums. Within natural history museums, the preserved collections are managed by curators and collections managers, typically with graduate level training in biodiversity and biological science. And there's a wide collections user base of natural history collections that expands beyond the museums themselves into academia and other sectors. Go ahead, next slide. And so collectively, we really need to bridge the cultures between our two worlds. We are two separate biological communities, but we have many shared interests and shared challenges that we're facing. The two collections communities are largely separate. We go to different meetings and conferences. We have different research priorities, different terminologies, and even when we're talking about in these collections communities, as they relate to our organizational mission, the role of basic science versus applied conservation, views on data standards. And these are really important to make explicit, to respect, and to try to understand and work through to see and ZooMu, the meetings we're holding in person really help seek to bridge cultures, foster introductions, and help us find common ground. Next slide. Next slide.
Is it not progressing?
No.
Okay, it should be on the slide that starts with at a national scale.
Oh, okay. I see it now. At a national scale, there's very few opportunities for external scientists to learn how to work effectively with zoos and aquariums. And this causes a lot of attention both with external scientists and with the zoos and aquariums. Natural history museums really view part of their role as service to a larger scientific community, and zoos and aquariums don't view their collections the same way. So one of the questions we're addressing in ZooMu is what kind of learning opportunities could help cross-train scientists to work across collection types. Next slide. And then when we look at how scientists are trained to do research on collections, academic partnerships are really common in natural history collections. Many natural history collections are tied to universities and have graduate students who are trained to curate, to care for, and to do research with those preserved collections. Within zoos and aquariums, there are really formalized training programs for veterinarians at the graduate level, as well as for animal care staff, but not for scientists working with living collections. So we want to take a look at some successful models for training biodiversity scientists working at zoos and aquariums and really assess whether this satisfies the national need and demand for research with living collections in zoos. Next up. And so again, our goals for the third working group. In the short term, we want to do an analysis and synthesis of training pipelines for researchers across collection types. In the medium term, we want to enhance and cross-train, create enhanced training and cross-training programs for zoo and natural history students and early career professionals to kind of build this network of people who can work across collection types. In the long term, what we'd really like to see is a mature network of scientists trained to work with both living
All right. So thank you again for everyone for joining in this webinar. If you want to find out more information about ZooMu, you can go to our website, zoomunetwork.org. There's a QR code there for everybody to use. If you're interested in any of the topical working groups or being connected to the regional network meetings, please send us an email. You can also join our Google group by emailing to this link below. And that way you can stay updated on future events, workshops, and the many webinars that we have coming up. All of this information is on our website, by the way, so you can always go back there. And then finally, I want to stress again, this is the start of a 5-year project, and we really do want a lot of input from the community on, thoughts and future directions and how you think ZooMu could be useful to you and your work. So please respond to our survey that we'll be sending out after this webinar.